Hey everyone, and welcome to season 2 of the Solving Problems podcast, where we help you use story to reach more people and grow your church. If we haven't met before, my name is Jonathan Caron, and I'm the host of the show. I'm joined as always by, actually not as always, Kyler, you weren't here every episode last year, were you?
Right. Yeah. This is season 2. So, I'm making big moves, and I'm here for the intro of pretty much every episode except for the episodes that I'm on this season. So
Yeah, because it'd be kind of weird to have you on the intro and then intro you in person. But since you're here, if people haven't met you, this is Kyler Nixon. He'll be with us in some form or another every episode this season. One of the things that we're not going to say every single week this year like we did last year, but we do want to say on the first episode here is that Kyler, myself, and all of our guests this season are StoryBrand certified guides. And Kyler, go ahead, since I'm talking a lot already, can you explain to people what a StoryBrand certified guide is?
Yeah, we're not affiliated with StoryBrand. We're not employees of StoryBrand, but we have gone to Nashville and gone through the StoryBrand certification process with Don Miller and his team. So we are certified StoryBrand guides, which means that we can help, and we do help churches and organizations create clear messaging and effective marketing. But we are not affiliated with StoryBrand. We're not employees of StoryBrand. And this podcast itself is not a StoryBrand podcast.
So that's the legal mumbo jumbo to get out of the way so that we can have some fun. One thing to know is that as part of our agreement with StoryBrand, certified guides, we don't teach you what StoryBrand is. We only help you implement it. So if you don't know what StoryBrand is and you want to know more about that, you can pick up Donald Miller's bestseller, Building a StoryBrand, or you could do the online workshop or attend a live class in Nashville if you want to learn more about it. So today and for every episode, we're going to assume that you know some of the basics of StoryBrand. If you don't, that's okay, because really we stay big picture. We don't dive into the details of what StoryBrand is. It's just using the themes and the ideas that are a part of StoryBrand. And one of those ideas is making the people we're communicating to, the people we're marketing to, the hero of the story. And in the church world, a lot of people get confused by that.
Right. Today we have Larry Hubatka, who is, did I say that right? I think I did. He's got a cool last name, but I always butcher it. He's on today. He is the general manager of Tiny Horse Agency. They work with a ton of large brands. I have the list, but I'm forgetting. They're like huge national brands. But he was also formerly the creative pastor at Elevation Church. And he's going to talk about how to make people the hero. He's going to give some cool theories and some thoughts behind how they did that at Elevation, how he does that personally. And it's a good episode. And before we jump in, Jonathan, I wanted to share a personal story with the listeners, because this is just totally sums up Larry and his character and kind of how he makes people personally the hero. This past October, depending on when you're listening to this, it may have been a long time ago, but in October, I went to a SALT conference in Nashville, and Larry was one of the keynote speakers. We were in the middle of season 1, and so I knew that we wanted to get Larry on this podcast for season 2. He's a certified guide as well. I went up to him after his keynote, and let me tell you, Larry made me feel like the most important person in that entire place. He had no idea who I was. He was the keynote speaker at one of the largest Christian creative conferences. And he looked me in the eye, he shook my hand, and was fully engaged in that conversation and made me personally feel like the hero. And so today in this conversation, he's going to talk a little bit about how they do that at Elevation and how he's done that in his agency and how he does that personally. So I'm excited for this. I think this is a concept that when churches grab onto this, it really is a game changer for them.
The problem we're going to tackle today is what I think is the hardest part about StoryBrand for many church people, and it's making people the hero. A lot of times in church, people think, no, Jesus is the hero of every story. And we almost called this podcast Jesus Ain't the Hero, but we thought a lot of you wouldn't listen if that was the title, so we didn't do that. The other objection is that we don't want to engage in making people feel like everything is about them even more than they already do. And those are two legitimate concerns, and I understand them both, which is why we're taking the time today to sort of debunk that and talk about what it looks like to make people the hero. And we're going to talk a little bit about the things we can do better to understand and empathize with the people we're trying to reach. At the very end, Larry talks about some of the stuff that he learned from Pastor Stephen Furtick when Stephen was talking about his preaching, but that Larry has now used with marketing and communications, of how we can combine all of this together and change how we approach ministry. One of the things that stuck out to me about that talk that Larry gave at SALT last fall was he said the phrase, "I love Jesus, but I want to see him delivered and packaged and presented to people in a way that makes sense to them."
Mhm.
And today, that's what we're talking about. How do we deliver and package Jesus so that we can present it to people in a way that makes sense for them? So we're going to bring the dance music back up, and on the other side, we'll be joined by Larry Hubatka of Tiny Horse Agency, formerly the creative pastor at Elevation Church. All right, we've got Larry here with us now. Larry, go ahead and say hey to everybody.
Hey, everybody.
So we set up everything in the intro. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into our first question. And that is, when we're talking about making the church attender the hero of our communications, of our marketing, what does that mean? And what does it look like?
Okay, so this question comes up all the time because you've got churches who are saying, well, it feels a little backwards, right? And I'm sure you've had this conversation, or if you're working for a church or connected to a ministry, maybe you're a volunteer or something like that. And somebody introduces this concept about making the person the hero. And the first pushback is like, no, Jesus is the hero, because we've literally gone through every amount of training that we can to say that Jesus is at the center. He is everything, which we all believe. In fact, my guess would be most people who are tuned in love the church, believe in the church, believe in the mission of the church, love Jesus, think he is the center of everything. Great. Got it out of the way. We're on the same page. Now we're talking about more of a marketing conversation. And, this sometimes ruffles feathers for people because, you can go look at websites out there that exist. I mean, I think that maybe the most prominent one was Church Marketing Sucks, that came out years ago. And people have differing opinions on how marketing should factor into the church. Here's my take. We're dealing with real people who live in the real world, and marketing works for real people who live in the real world. So when you start talking about how does the church do marketing, I mean, it can be really impersonal if you want it to be, or you can say, well, we are using tools that are available to us to reach people. And one of those tools that's really effective is treating your audience like they're the hero if you're a brand. Now we're like getting into like uncharted waters here, where some people are like, no, the church isn't a brand. The church is the church. I'm like, great. If you get hung up on semantics, you can have that argument all day long. We'll go reach people. So I think this concept of making people the hero is about building our ministries, building our churches with the people who are going to attend at the center of the conversation on how to reach them, how to bring them to church, as opposed to pretending like, this is like an old Field of Dreams philosophy where if we build it, they'll come. I'm like, no, that's not true. You can build some really awesome stuff that's accurate, that's theologically sound, that's like biblically compliant, that nobody will come to because it doesn't actually help people. It doesn't help make them the hero. It doesn't help in their own lives. It doesn't help make them the hero in their families or as parents, meaning they don't find it valuable. So it can be true and completely invaluable, and that doesn't work. At the end of the day, you don't have a ministry if it's totally accurate and nobody shows up.
And one of the things we talked about last season on here is that marketing and discipleship are two different things.
Yes.
And your marketing plan is not going to be the same thing as your discipleship plan. But if you do it the right way, if you do it the way we're talking about, that marketing plan can feed into your discipleship funnel.
Yes.
Because if we don't have people showing up, we could have the best discipleship funnel, but it's going to be empty.
That's right. In fact, it was probably 2 weeks ago, I was having a conversation with my wife, and I said, I think I'm going to write a book, and it's going to be called Yes, That's True, But I Don't Care. Because we've somehow lost our way that context really makes a difference in people's lives. So my personal opinion would be maybe the first level of kind of awareness or education or wisdom is to get it right, meaning to speak the truth. The second level is to speak it in a way that somebody can understand it and actually run with it and do something with it and apply it to their lives. So I'm not going to fault anybody for saying, it's true. I don't understand why you don't get it. Well, I'm not disagreeing. Of course it's true. But if you don't package that truth in a way that I can understand it, see how it applies to my life, well, it's not as helpful to me. Doesn't mean it's not true. It's just not as helpful to me. It's like speaking a different language.
I think that's one of the things about making the hero. I think the word hero, hangs some people up, and it's really just about making it applicable to people and making it, I hate to use the word relevant because it's not 2004 anymore, but making it relevant to what they're going through and tying it back into the story that their life is living.
That's right. And people are more accepting of the term hero if they understand it within the context of a story, like the basic elements of a story, the beginning, the middle, the end of a story, the characters in a story. There's a protagonist and an antagonist, or there's a hero and there's a villain. Okay, now it makes a little more sense to say the church attender is the hero. Now it's a little more palatable, right? So if we can figure out how to help people understand what we're saying, because we're kind of doing the same thing even in this podcast. We're using the term hero, and the assumption is that somebody's like, gotcha, we're talking about within the context of a story. Well, yeah, if you hear that, you totally get it. But when we go into church, we talk about making our attendee the hero, or our church attender the hero, and we start using language like right out of the gate that alienates people because we haven't given them context. So we start saying things that you would only understand or you'd only recognize if you've been in the church for 10 years, or maybe you're like a progressive church, or you're pretty modern or contemporary, and you're saying things that you think are pretty familiar to people. And they're like, no, I grew up in a really traditional church. I don't actually know what that means. So this is part of the conversation that we can, address if you'd like, or not. But part of making them the hero is helping them feel like they belong, right? Feeling like they fit in, feeling like this is a place that's for them. It was designed with them in mind.
What are some ways that you've got a lot of experience in church? What are some ways that you guys have done that before?
When somebody feels like they belong, they feel like it was, the experience was designed with them in mind, meaning somebody who created this experience or this moment or this interaction, they did it with an understanding of the world that I believe in. So on one hand, you've got some very kind of standard, typical stuff that, again, these things ruffle feathers, but it depends on what you're trying to pull off. You might do a cover song in church. You might cover a top 40 song or a song that you hear on the radio. I have a personal preference that I don't personally really like doing that. However, based on what we're trying to accomplish as a church, I actually love when we do that because I understand what happens when somebody walks into church who, let's say they hadn't been in church in 10 years. They hear a song that's familiar to them. Well, now you've got a person who hasn't been in church for 10 years who's already on edge because they were trying to figure out, what should I wear when I come to church? Is it going to be weird? Is it going to be like the church I went to when I grew up? Or is it going to be totally different? It seems like people are all about this. They're putting bumper stickers on their cars and wearing t-shirts. I'm already a little freaked out. So whatever we can do to put them at ease immediately, we want to try to do that. So hearing a song that you might hear on the radio, you might feel like it's a little out of place if you've been in church your whole life, or you might think, okay, that's a tool that we use to help somebody just let down a little bit. So when they walk in, they feel like, okay, cool, I get it. This church understands the world that I live in. I think that makes all the difference in the world because this is about putting somebody at ease so they can actually hear what's being said to them, or they can receive what it is that somebody's trying to hand to them or share with them while they're there for that, that hour and a half on a Sunday morning. So something like a song, I think, is an easy one. I think language is always so critical. I mean, I kind of jokingly poke fun at the fact that, the church still uses terms for parts of the church, like the narthex, that, like, I think most people who didn't grow up in church don't even know what that word means.
I grew up in church and I don't know what it means.
Yeah, right. I mean, we could sit down and be like, I think the narthex, and we could come up with all these different things. And when you break it down, the narthex is about, it's about as close to a lobby as we're going to get. So how about I'll meet you in the lobby? People understand lobby.
But even then, it's like naming rooms, certain things. Like every room has to have a name. Like go down to the garage and meet people at this event or whatever. Right. Like it doesn't make sense to people.
That's right. And I don't mind branding stuff. Again, this is kind of like business or marketing 101. I don't mind branding stuff, but don't call it the garage with the assumption that everybody knows that it's the garage. We have to be communicating with people in a way that shows, okay, we're going to just make an assumption that you might not fully understand everything that we currently do at this church because this is your first time here. So instead of meet you at the garage, We'll meet you at the garage. In fact, as soon as you exit, the garage is right in front of you. You'll see a sign right over the top of it that says garage. We'll meet you there. That little 5 seconds worth of context, man, that sure helps people feel like they fit in. But little stuff like little words like garage and manipulating our language really makes a big difference. Fellowship versus hanging out. Well, guess what? Fellowship is true. It's accurate. It's real. It's a word that we don't totally use. Get saved. Get saved it's accurate. I believe that word. I think someone who's here for the first time at a church was like, get saved from what? Sometimes they don't even have the context. So, somebody who's decided to live their life for Jesus. Now, I'm not saying dumb everything down, water it down. We don't have to be super, the church likes to say seeker, sensitive. Call it whatever you want. The goal is, can we communicate in the same language? If we can, awesome. If we can't, we're going to have a really hard time ever connecting.
But even if we took these things and only explained them 10% of the time, that's so much better than what we've been doing, because I can't tell you how many times I've sat in church and the pastor's like, hey, will you stand for scripture today? Well, why? And you don't have to explain to me every single time, but if you just take, again, 5-10 seconds, we just want to honor the word of God today by standing.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I get that. That makes sense. Or, walking into church, and I don't remember if I told this story on another episode. If I did, sorry, but my church does this thing where we do an intro video before the service starts. And with a minute to go in the intro video, everyone stands and claps. And the first time I saw that when I was in the church, I thought we were part of a cult, because everyone just started standing and clapping at once, and I didn't know why. But just explanations of things like that, of why we raise our hands in worship. And we don't have to do that every single week, because that would get obnoxious. But occasionally, if we're going to sing a song talking about raising our hands above our head, like, use that moment to just, hey, this is why we do this. Help me understand why we're doing what we're doing. And I was thinking about this last week. It's funny to me that the catchphrase in church recently is "you belong here."
Right.
Yet we operate in ways where we have our own language and we do things that make people feel like they don't belong at all.
That's right.
I heard a quote from you just doing some research for today's interview.
Sure.
And you said, when people don't feel like they're included or that they belong, we lose the opportunity to speak into their lives.
That's right. So my thought behind that is, we talk so much about wanting to engage a culture or engage an audience or help somebody feel like they fit in. And I mean, you can take this all the way back to, 5 decades and look at Maslow's hierarchy, and belonging is like the third step in the hierarchy, right? There's like a very clear necessity to belong. The challenge is, we assume that because people walk through the doors, that they've given us enough permission to feel like we can just kind of include you into our world and speak to you as if you're one of our own. I don't know if I think that's true. I love that somebody walked through the doors. And if anything, I consider it a great privilege that we would have the opportunity to share our beliefs and maybe educate or inform somebody. But I'm going to take it out of the ministry side and put it in the marketing side. And I know a lot of people will fuss about like leaning so heavily on marketing, but I just think it's a tool that's available to us. It's what I do for a living. It's the way that I approach even ministry. And that marketing generally serves 3 purposes. It serves 1, to inform, 2, to persuade, or 3, to remind. And so if I broke down what we were doing on the weekends into those 3 categories, inform, persuade, remind, well, we're doing the same things. And now we're just trying to do those things as effectively as we can. So when somebody feels like they don't belong, they're going to disconnect. They're going to feel like they're not really my people. And if they don't feel like they belong, they don't feel like they're in their community or with their tribe, well, they're going to be less likely to receive. Now, certainly you've got, exceptions where somebody's just open-minded and they kind of listen to everything and process and ingest and then make their own decisions. That's not most people. Most people, we're trying to help them understand, because if they don't understand, if they don't have context, good luck ever trying to connect with them and engage with them at the level that we want to. So I just feel like it's our responsibility as churches, as people in ministry who either do it vocationally or do it as a volunteer. Like my wife and I were still volunteering on the weekends and very much connected to our church. I feel like it's my responsibility to help somebody who walks up onto our campus or up to one of our buildings to feel like, hey, this is for you. And if they feel that, well, maybe there's a shot that they might receive a little differently. If they don't feel it, good luck trying to speak into their lives.
And it all comes down to empathy for them. Like we have to try to understand what their life is like, and life outside of church staff and like life of normal people is totally different than those of us who are on staff at a church. And I think I've told this story before, but I'll mention it again. I have never learned as much about church as I did as when I left church staff. Because the entire time I was on church staff, I never drove into the parking lot between services. I never had to find a parking space and then walk into the building and then check my kids into kids ministry and then find a seat in the worship area and find someone to sit with. And like just saying that feels stressful. I got to cherry pick my spot in front of the same tree every single week, an hour and a half before anyone got there. And so I had no clue what a person walking into church was experiencing each week. I was just the guy there running the services and trying to create the environment where they were going to meet Jesus. And I had no way to empathize with what they were going through. Just moving forward a little bit, for us to help people feel like they belong and to empathize with them more, how do we get a better understanding of how do we get a better understanding of the people who are coming to our church and what they're experiencing? Meaning their whole weekend did not likely revolve around the church service that we're at or that we've been planning. How do we understand better their life, their concerns? Because we're a lot of times in church volunteer mode, in church staff mode, we're in our own little bubble. So empathizing with people, we have the curse of knowledge. We don't understand what they're going through. Has there been anything that you have found to help you connect with people who are coming to church but aren't from the church background?
I don't know if there are specific things that we're doing tactically, but I can tell you that, you've mentioned empathy several times. I do think it is the skill to learn to be effective as a ministry. I think as a business, anybody who has an audience they're trying to reach, if we don't learn to empathize, we're going to be in trouble. So what's interesting about empathy is I think it's rooted in living in the reality of what's going on. And here's what I mean. At Elevation, we don't talk about this very publicly, but it's not that it's a secret. I just think it's language that, in some seasons it's much more upfront, in other seasons it's not. But we don't go through a membership class as much as we say, hey, we want you to participate. And the participation is essentially framed up in the 4 G's, the letter G: growth, gifts, giving, and groups. So, growth, be a part of inviting people to, be a part of the ministry. Gifts, use your gifts, serve, be a part of a volunteer team, just, give back. Giving, trust God with your finances. And groups, let's make sure that we're connected to other people so that the church feels like it becomes a lot more manageable in terms of the size. So we don't say this, but it'll help make this point. I think in a perfect world, we're like, man, we want 4G participants at this church, right? People who are participating in all 4 Gs. Getting back to our empathy and our reality comment or topic, I think the reality is, I think our very best people are like 2.8 to 3.4 Gs. So what I'm saying is, like, I'll use my wife and I as an example. We are super committed to the church growing. However, I don't invite every single person I ever meet, but I certainly try to invite people opportunistically when I feel like there's an opportunity to do it. So I'm making this very objective. This is not how we would typically do it, but I'm just using it for the sake of this illustration. So I'm kind of like a 0.6 or something there. Gifts and serving. Yeah, we serve on a volunteer team. We lead a volunteer team, pretty involved there. So, okay, maybe we're a 1 or a 0.9. Giving, we're giving consistently, systematically, regularly. Okay, we're probably a 1 there. In a group, we've been in a group or leading a group almost the entire time we've been at the church, but we've had maybe like the summers or something where we don't do it because a lot of people take some time off, or we were not leading, but we were involved in one. So maybe we're like a 0.6, 0.7. So you like do the math there and you're like, okay, I think we're as committed as you can be to the ministry, and we're like a 3.5. So when I say, live in reality, if I were on the leadership side of the church, I would say our very best people are somewhere between like 3 and 3.5. Those are our best people in terms of how many G's they're actively participating in. So in order to empathize with them, we have to empathize, assuming that, yes, we want you to be all 4. We want you to be all 4. Awesome. We're going to promote all 4. The reality is very few people, if anyone, is all 4 all the time. You might be for a minute or a short window, but generally you're going to be very active in the church and there pretty consistently, pretty involved. You still love the church. You're still like very passionate, but you're not perfect in it. So if we don't empathize with the fact that, to your point earlier, people are not thinking about the ministry all week long the way that we might be if we're either on the staff or we're leading in the church, that's okay. Let's just acknowledge that. If they're not thinking about it all week long, are there things that we can be doing to help it become a part of their just natural cadence and routine and thought process without it being mechanical or without it being transactional, but helping it become a little more routine? So if we acknowledge that, and we acknowledge that the normal person who wants to come in and be a part of this, a lot of people love it and they'll take time off of work to come be a part of this. Most people, they love it and they think they love it and they want to try to come as much as they can. So we have to recognize, okay, people fall into different categories and the reality of their lives, even though we're going to speak to that person that we want to kind of aspirationally speak towards a heavy involvement, a full involvement. We also have to recognize the reality that even our best people aren't full throttle all the time. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I think living in the reality of where people typically are, for example, like small groups, is a really great perspective to have, because small groups should meet all year round. Realistically, you probably start somewhere in the fall, you go up through Christmas, maybe take 2, 3, 4 weeks off around Christmas, start again at the beginning of the year, you go through probably the end of the school year. And then this summer period, you might get together less frequently, like once a month or a couple times over the summer, not because you don't want to get together, but because of schedules. Now, all of a sudden we just discovered, now we just discovered, okay, the best small group attendee goes 9 out of 12 months of the year. That is awesome. That's an A+. Now you can go every single week all year if you want. You can go twice a week if you want. We just realized most people don't do that. So I think living in the reality makes a huge difference.
Right. So we can expect that from people.
That's right. Exactly. So my long-winded answer to your question.
No, you're good. All right. Last thing here, and then we'll let you go. So we've been talking theoretical here. I want to go a little practical here and talk about how does making people the hero, making people we're trying to reach the hero, change how we do ministry? Do you have a framework or anything for how we can approach this that will really help us think through what we do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've heard my pastor say this, I don't know how many times. He talks a lot about his preaching, and Pastor Stephen Furtick will say, it really was a big shift for me in preaching when I stopped thinking about what I was saying and how cool it was and how witty it was or how smart it was. And I started thinking, I wonder what kind of person this message or this preaching is going to produce, right? Or is going to help produce. Well, I have taken that and I have applied that to the way that I approach business and marketing and ministry, so many times over. I would start with the question, what kind of person do we want to help create on the backside of this experience, right? So if we're saying somebody is going to attend our church, well, when they've been here for a year or 2 years or 5 years, or when we say they're fully invested and they're all in or they're participating at the highest level, what do we want them to look like? What do we want their life to be like? And so we start with the end in mind. That's where we're going. Then step 2 would be, how does that person get there, right? We might call it a customer map or a customer journey. If we were, working with a brand, I think we do the same thing in ministry. We say, how does that this is not even inclusive of us yet. We're not even talking about us. We're talking fully about the person. If we want to create people who are, and obviously, when I say create people, hopefully people can understand what I'm saying and not think that we think we're responsible for transforming and changing people. No, we're doing our part to help someone go through that process. But if the kind of person we want to create is generous, kind, and making faith decisions consistently in their life, and maybe a confident parent, right? Whatever, pick your criteria. Great. How they get there is, if you want to be generous, well, you probably have to understand generosity. You probably have to practice generosity, and you can come up with all your steps for what does it look like to become a generous person, a kind person, a faithful person, a confident parent. And so now we're on to step 3, and this is where we actually insert ourselves. We say, great, we know what kind of person they want to become, the path to get there. Step 3 is, how can we help them actually do that as a ministry or as an individual person? So now finally we're in the conversation. And then step 4 would be, what tools do we need to support them at that level? If we want to help inform somebody about the benefits or the feelings of fulfillment that come with being a generous person, great. We probably now need to communicate that information. What tools do we need to communicate? We might need some marketing collateral. We might need a website. We might need an email list. So the steps are, I think they can be pretty objective, but it really starts with, where are we going? What kind of person do we want to create? How does that person get there? How do we play a part in helping them get there? And then what tools are required to play that part in supporting them?
If we contrast that framework with how traditionally we've done ministry, which is, hey, we want to do a class on whatever, or we want to do a teaching series on this. We've just kind of, hey, God's leading us here, let's do this. And we just kind of did it, and we hope people came along for the ride. What you're saying is take what God's leading us to already, but then say, okay, God's leading us to do a series on giving. And so if we're going on giving, then then take it, and then take what God's doing already, and then look at it from the person's perspective of what kind of person do we want to help make them be. And that's what it looks like to make people a hero. It's not that we want to serve their every need or that we want to make it all about them. We just want to package what God's already doing in a way that makes the most impact.
I think that's right. I think that there's a fine line here where people could misunderstand what we're saying, and I'm glad you addressed that. We're not trying to cater to the person who comes to church's every need. I think that would be a poor experience, because at the end of the day, people don't even really know what they need. They only know what they think they need, and sometimes you give them that very thing, and they get into it, and they're like, oh, that's not actually what I needed. The benefit to what we do in ministry is, I think we actually do know what people need based on the Bible. We're looking for a sense of fulfillment, a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. So we can always help people move that direction. Now, to your point, there's an X factor in ministry, because I do believe in a leader who has been appointed to lead a church. I believe that they oftentimes have a, kind of a supernatural or an X factor that is, I don't know how to explain it, but I really have an intuition, or I've got a gut feeling that we ought to go this direction. Well, I would never discount that. I feel like that's common. I would take that, however, and I would probably run it through a filter to say, how does that work, and how does that fit with the larger ecosystem of how we're trying to work with people, how we're trying to reach people, how we're trying to help people become, the best version of themselves. So you started that question by saying, traditionally we do it one way, and now we're doing it this way. Traditionally, I think what we've done as ministries is we've said, we've got something really cool to offer. Let's do this. We think people are going to love it. And I think we've tried to do it with a sound insight and education about who our people are. But sometimes we do that, it doesn't work, and we get frustrated and can't understand why the church isn't responding. Well, it might be because, let's just say it was a season that we were going through, and people weren't very responsive at the time. Maybe it was that worked 5 years ago, but it doesn't work great right now. Maybe it was we just recently spoke to something of a similar nature, and people didn't really have the capacity to ingest kind of the same or similar content. It could be a variety of different things. But instead of starting with, here's what we want to do, I do think we have to have a vision of who we want to become, even as a ministry. But the more who we want to become aligns with who people want to become, and we can live in the overlap, I think we can be really effective, because now we're helping people become who they hope to become the best that they can tell. We're refining their perspective of who they want to become, because we're expounding upon it, right? They're saying, yeah, I want to come to church and be a good person, and I want to be faithful. I want to be a good dad. I'm like, great. Let's talk a little bit about being a good dad. What does that look like? That's about challenging your kids to walk in truth, to have great boundaries, to surround themselves with quality people. So now we're helping them expand what they thought they needed, because we're like, that's our job as the ministry, is to overlay the truth of God's scripture with what you want for your life. And all of a sudden, if we can align those things with the mission of the church, we have this triple threat where everything's coming into alignment. The God's word, the vision of the church, someone's personal perspective of where they want to go. And that almost feels magical, right? It's like, wow, feels like the church is like popping right now.
And it takes all three.
That's right.
For us to have the impact that we want to have, that we feel like we're called to have, it takes all three. And I think it goes back to, and we'll close on this, it goes back to what you were saying earlier. If we have the best ideas and the best intentions, but no one shows up, or no one takes what we're doing to heart, then we don't really have much to begin with.
That's right.
So making people the hero is really just another way of saying we have to make everything we do connect with people on a personal level. And if we're not doing that, then we're not really doing much at all.
That's right. I mean, we're either going to make ourselves feel good because we did what we wanted, or we're going to help other people feel fulfilled because we're going to help them become who they want. Now, who they want, again, we can maybe help refine that and expound upon their perspective of what they want, or their vision for their own life, because we want to infuse God's word into it and how they can play a role in something bigger than themselves. But generally, yeah, we're focused on them. Let's help them get where they want to go based on the thing that God's doing in their lives. All of a sudden, they come to church every week and they feel like, this is invaluable. How could I not be here every week? I feel like every single time I come, I'm not just getting a pep talk, or I'm getting a little bit of guilt relief, but I'm actually moving toward becoming the kind of person I want to become.
That's awesome. And we're going to end right there. Larry, thanks so much for your time today.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me.
That is it for this week's episode. I want to thank Larry so much for hanging out with us. There was probably about 20 minutes or so of that interview that we had to cut out just for time. So thank him for all the great nuggets he dropped in there. Next week, we're going to be here with me and Kyler for the entire episode, talking about the curse of knowledge. We hit on that a little bit last season in episode 6, but the curse of knowledge and how we sometimes can turn people away from engaging and interacting with us as a church without even knowing it. So we're going to talk about that next week. And then that's the first of a 2-part episode on the curse of knowledge. So really excited about that. Going to go ahead and ask you to subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes, on Spotify, Google Play, wherever you listen to podcasts. Go ahead and subscribe, rate, and review. But that's it for this week. If you want to get in touch with us, I'm at Jonathan_Carone on Twitter and Instagram. Kyler is at Kyler_Nixon. We'll be back with you next week, and we hope you all have a great week.